Thousands of people across 6 decades on 6 continents report being taken by extraterrestrials, by beings with grey skin, large black eyes, and no apparent interest in small talk. The accounts differ in detail: the craft, the duration, the aftermath. But one thing repeats across cultures, across languages, across people who have never met and never will. The beings ask a question, not many questions. One. It sounds almost mundane the first time you hear it. Almost. I want to start with a woman named Judy Doherty. Most people haven't heard of her. She doesn't appear in the headline cases. She isn't Barney and Betty Hill. She isn't Travis Walton. She's a Texas housewife who, on the night of May 23rd, 1973, was driving home with her family south of Houston when she saw a light in the sky that she couldn't explain. She thought little of it at the time. What she remembered consciously was almost nothing. A light, a strange feeling. Then home. What she remembered under hypnotic regression, conducted years later by respected researcher Dr. Leo Sprinkle, was something considerably more disturbing. She described being lifted, being observed, being shown things she didn't have vocabulary for. And then, in the middle of a scene that still makes researchers uncomfortable to revisit, she described the beings pausing, looking at her, and asking, through some method she couldn't quite call speech, something she interpreted as, "What do you feel?" Not "Who are you?" Not "Where do you come from?" Not "What is the structure of your government or the range of your weapons?" "What do you feel?" "I filed that away. I kept going. I shouldn't have filed it away." Because the deeper I looked into the testimony archive, and I mean the real archive, not the highlight reel, not the cases that make cable television high, the more that question, or some version of it, kept surfacing, kept repeating. In reports from rural Brazil in the 1950s, in transcripts from rural England in the 1980s, in accounts filed quietly with MUFON in the 1990s, that nobody ever turned into a book. The same question. Or close enough to the same question that the difference starts to feel irrelevant. What do you feel? Or what is it like to be you? Or what happens inside you when this occurs? Or, in one of the stranger cases I'll get to later, can you show us? These aren't the questions of a civilization that knows everything about us. These are the questions of a civilization trying to understand something they can't access by other means. And that specific limitation is what I want to pull on. Because once you see the shape of what they appear not to know, you cannot look at these cases the same way again. Let me ground this before we go further. The mainstream literature on alien abduction, the Hill case, Whitley Strieber's Communion, the Hopkins and Jacobs research archives, tends to emphasize the physical examination, the probes, the samples, the apparent biological interest in human reproductive systems. And all of that is real testimony, documented and cross-referenced, and I'm not dismissing it, but it has, I think, somewhat dominated how we framed what the beings want. We assumed they wanted our biology. Maybe they do. But the testimony, read in full, suggests something running parallel to the biological interest, something that the physical examination alone couldn't resolve, something they kept asking about even after the examination was complete. Bud Hopkins, the late artist and pioneering abduction researcher, spent decades conducting interviews with abductees in New York. His work is mainstream enough, but buried in his notes, less cited, less glamorous, are repeated references to what he called the effect inquiry. He noticed across dozens of subjects that the beings often paused during or after their procedures and appeared to direct attention not at the body, but at the emotional state of the person on the table. He described it in a 1992 lecture at MIT's Symposium on Anomalous Experiences as a persistent interest in the interior life of the subject that bordered, if I'm being honest, on urgency. Urgency. That word stuck with me. Why urgency? If you're a civilization advanced enough to cross interstellar distances or whatever the mechanism of transit actually is. Why do you approach human emotional experience with something that registers as urgency? What could you be missing that would make that question feel pressing? Now, let me take you somewhere further from the spotlight. In 1957, a Brazilian farmer named Antonio Villas-Boas reported what became one of the most detailed and bizarre early contact cases on record. The case is known, but usually for the more sensational elements, the ones that make it easy to dismiss or mock. What gets less attention is what happened near the end of his account, after everything else had occurred, after the beings had done what they came to do. Villas-Boas said one of them stopped, looked at him in a way he described as different from the clinical attention he'd received before, and communicated something he interpreted in broken impressions as curiosity about whether he had been harmed, whether he was suffering. He was confused by this. He was a practical man. He said he didn't understand why they would care, having apparently cared very little about his consent throughout the encounter. But that question, "Are you suffering?" is not a question you ask a specimen. It's a question you ask a subject whose interior experience matters to you. It implies that suffering, as a category, is something they recognize but don't fully comprehend, something they need to verify empirically, from the inside. Now move forward 20 years. Move to England. In 1979, a forestry worker named Robert Taylor had a brief but intensely physical encounter on Livingston, West Lothian, Scotland. An encounter that left physical marks on the ground and physical injuries on Taylor himself. The case is well documented. Police actually filed a criminal investigation report, one of the very few instances in which a UFO encounter was treated as a crime scene. Taylor himself was a practical, taciturn man, not given to elaboration, but in his account of the beings, his was brief, and the physical altercation dominated the story. There's a moment often glossed over. He said they seemed to pause and look at him when he cried out in pain, not to inflict more pain, not to stop, just to watch the pain. He said it felt like they were recording it, like it was information they needed. Recording pain, recording suffering, recording. And here's where the pattern tightens into something I couldn't explain away: emotional response. Let me give you one more before I explain why these three moments, separated by continents and decades, form something that the official explanation collapses to contain. In the late 1980s, a woman I'll call Margaret, her full identity was protected at her request in the original MUFON filing, case reference withheld per investigator instruction, reported a prolonged contact experience in rural Minnesota. Her case was investigated by a regional researcher named David Dobbs, whose work remained largely unpublished and was shared with me through a private archive inherited by a colleague. Margaret described a standard examination sequence: the table, the light, the beings moving around her with what she interpreted as professional detachment. And then, she said, one of them held her hand, not to restrain her. She was specific about this. She was no longer being restrained at that point. It held her hand and, through whatever mechanism they used for communication, asked, "What is this?" She asked what they meant. The impression she received back was something like, "This that you are doing inside, this change, what is it?" She was crying. She didn't know she was crying until they pointed to it, and what they were asking about, as best as she could translate it, was not the tears. It was the feeling that caused the tears, the grief or the fear or whatever emotional state had produced that physical response. They could see the physical response. They could measure it, presumably. But the interior state that caused it, that was what they were asking about. What is this? 3 cases, 3 different countries, 3 different decades, 3 different witnesses who had, as far as anyone has been able to establish, no contact with each other. And across all 3, the same fundamental inquiry. Not the body, but what happens inside it. Not the biology, but the phenomenology. Not the fact of human emotion, but what emotion is from the inside. Once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Here's a question I want to sit with for a moment. If you could observe humanity from outside, could analyze our brain chemistry, our hormone fluctuations, our neurological architecture, would that tell you what grief feels like? Would it tell you what hope feels like? Would it tell you the specific interior quality of the moment a human being realizes something they cannot undo? I don't think it would. And I think that might be exactly the problem they're trying to solve. There's a concept in philosophy of mind called the hard problem of consciousness, a term coined by David Chalmers in 1995, though the problem itself is far older. The hard problem is the question of why physical processes in the brain give rise to subjective experience at all. Why there is something it is like to see red rather than simply a wavelength being processed. Why pain feels like something rather than simply being a signal. We haven't solved it. Neuroscience has made extraordinary progress on the easy problems, the mechanisms by which we process sensory information, regulate behavior, form memories. But the subjective interior experience itself, the felt quality of being alive, that remains, in Chalmers' framing, hard in the specific sense that no physical description seems to close the gap. Now, what if an extraterrestrial civilization faces the same problem from the outside? What if they can read everything we emit, every hormone, every electrical signal, every physiological indicator, and still cannot access the interior experience those signals correspond to? What if the felt quality of human emotion is genuinely opaque to them, not because of a failure of technology, but because of a fundamental limit on what exterior observation can capture? That would explain the urgency Hopkins noticed. That would explain why, across case after case, the question recurs even after the examination is complete. The examination gets them the biology. The question is an attempt to get something the biology cannot deliver. And if that's what they're doing, if that's what all of this is, then the implications branch in directions I find genuinely unsettling. Let me speculate, because this is the part of the investigation where the evidence runs ahead of confirmation, and you have two choices: stop or follow carefully and label what you're doing. I'm following, and I'm labeling it. Possibility 1, they have no emotional experience of their own. Not suppressed, not translated differently, absent. The beings described in abduction testimony, consistently described across decades by people who've never compared notes, are, notably, almost pointedly, effectively neutral. No anger, no excitement, no apparent distress. They perform complex operations with the focus of someone completing a form. The uniformity of that description is, on its own, worth examining. If witnesses were simply projecting, we'd expect more variation, more anthropomorphization, more projection of fear or malevolence or warmth, depending on the emotional state of the witness. Instead, across the board, neutral, methodical, empty in the affective sense. But a civilization without emotion would still need to understand emotion if it were trying to interact with a species that runs on it, and they appear to be trying to understand it from first principles, from the ground up. By asking the people who have it, possibility 2, they have something analogous to emotion, but so differently structured that human emotional experience is not merely foreign to them, it's illegible. The way colour is illegible to someone born without photoreceptors. Not just unfamiliar, categorically inaccessible. This would mean that when they hold Margaret's hand and ask, "What is this?" they are not asking a naive question. They are asking an actually hard question, the hardest question. They can see the tears, they can read the neurochemistry. They cannot feel or understand or model what produced it. And they need to. Why do they need to? That's where this becomes impossible to ignore. If you're studying a species in order to interact with it, coexist with it, or, and I'll put this plainly, influence it, you need to understand how it makes decisions. And human decision making is not primarily rational. We know this. Behavioral economics has spent 50 years demonstrating that human choices are driven by emotional states in ways that defy purely logical modelling. Fear, love, grief, hope. These are not decorative features of human cognition. They are the engine. While a civilization trying to predict, model, or influence human behavior that cannot access human emotional experience is working with an incomplete map. They might know everything about our biology, they might know our history, our social structures, our technologies, but if they can't model how a human being feels, truly feels from the inside, then their model of us has a fundamental gap. And the question, asked across decades, suggests they know the gap is there. That's the thing that keeps me up at night, frankly. Not that they're asking, but that they know they need to ask, that they are sophisticated enough to recognize the limit of what their instruments can capture, and are attempting, a key with what Hopkins called urgency, to close it through direct testimony, through asking the people on the table. Think about what that means. We are, in some sense, the only ones who can answer the question. Our subjective experience is not accessible by exterior means. It cannot be extracted, scanned, or sampled. It can only be imperfectly, approximately, communicated. And they know this. And they keep trying. There's a name for that dynamic. It's called an intelligence gap. And every intelligence operation in human history, when it encounters an intelligence gap, escalates its efforts to close it. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. I want to spend a moment with Whitley Strieber, because his case, well documented, endlessly debated, contains something relevant that doesn't get sufficient attention. Strieber's Communion, published in 1987, is the mainstream entry point for most people. The cover alone, the alien face, the image so iconic it essentially defined how we picture the Greys for a generation. But Strieber's later work, his journals, his The Key, his ongoing Dreamland podcast interviews contains something the original book only gestures at. He describes, across multiple encounters, beings that appeared specifically interested in what he calls the weight of the self. Not his body, not his memories in a narrative sense, but the felt burden of being a conscious creature, the texture of self-awareness. He quotes one being, or his reconstruction of what one being communicated, as asking something like, "Do you know what you are?" And when he tried to answer intellectually with descriptions of human biology or social structure, the impression he received back was that this was not what was being asked. What was being asked was whether he knew what it felt like to be him. Strieber is a complicated witness. I know that. His history as a novelist, his documented psychological complexity, his fluctuating certainty about his own experiences, none of this makes him a clean source. But what's interesting for our purposes is that his description of that specific inquiry matches the pattern already established by Judy Dorati, by the Villas-Boas account, by Margaret in rural Minnesota, by Robert Taylor watching the beings watch his pain. They are not asking about the species. They are asking about the individual, about what it is like specifically to be inside this particular experience. As if the individual instance of human emotion is the data point, not the general category. That's a methodologically interesting approach, if you think about it. If you were trying to map a phenomenon you couldn't directly access, and you couldn't get to the general through instruments, you might try to approach it through specific cases, through testimony, through repeated targeted interviews with subjects selected, because they have access to the thing you need. And here's the strangest part. They keep doing it, decade after decade, case after case, which either means they haven't found what they're looking for, or the data collection process is itself the point, or, and I'll just put this on the table, what they're trying to understand is something that doesn't reduce to a fixed answer, something that varies, something that is different for every person, every encounter, every moment. Human emotion is not uniform. It is not a constant. It shifts and mutates and contradicts itself. Maybe that's the problem. Maybe they're trying to map a territory that keeps changing. I want to talk about documentation for a moment, or rather the absence of it. In the United States, between 1952 and 1969, the Air Force ran Project Blue Book, the official investigation into UFO sightings. 12,618 reports, 701 classified as unexplained. But here's what Blue Book never investigated: abduction accounts. Officially, the program didn't pursue cases involving direct physical interaction with beings. The focus was aerial phenomena. Contact cases fell into a gap between jurisdictions, too bizarre for the Air Force, not criminal enough for law enforcement, unless something like the Robert Taylor incident forced it. The result is that the primary documentation of abduction testimony, including the cases where this recurring question appears, exists almost entirely in private archives, in researchers' notes, in hypnotherapy session recordings that were never systematically catalogued, in MUFON reports that range from meticulously investigated to barely legible. This raises a simple but critical question. What does that documentation gap tell us? If there were official interest in what the beings were asking, not just in the craft, not just in the aerial display, those records would exist somewhere. The methodology of the inquiry, the pattern of the question, the recurring focus on emotional phenomenology. If any official body had paid attention to the content of what witnesses reported, rather than the logistics of the sightings, we might have a coherent body of evidence by now, systematically gathered, cross-referenced, analysed. Instead, we have scattered notes, private archives, researchers working in isolation who occasionally compared findings at small conferences and emerged looking shaken. Dr. Thomas Bullard, a folklorist at Indiana University, conducted one of the most rigorous comparative studies of abduction accounts ever completed, analysing 300 cases for structural consistency. His 1987 report, largely overlooked by mainstream media, found extraordinary narrative uniformity across accounts that could not, in his assessment, be adequately explained by cultural contamination alone. The examination sequence, the being's demeanour, the communication style, the specific quality of the questions they asked, all of it consistent across cases gathered from sources that had no apparent connection to each other. Bullard was careful. He was a folklorist, not an advocate. He didn't conclude that the events were literally real. What he concluded was that the consistency itself required explanation, and that no existing explanation, hoax, fantasy, cultural mythology, fully accounted for it. The consistency of the question across his sample was something he noted but didn't foreground. I think he should have foregrounded it. Because if 300 people independently across decades report the same beings asking some version of the same question about emotional experience, that's not a cultural archetype doing its work. That's a signal. There's something I've been circling and I want to approach it directly. Every witness who describes this question describes it arriving not as sound, not as words, but as something more like a direct impression. A concept without a container. Something they then translate into language after the fact. And the translation is always, by their own admission, approximate. Betty Hill, in her famous regression sessions with Dr. Benjamin Simon in 1964, described a form of communication that bypassed language entirely. She didn't hear words, she received concepts. Her descriptions of what the beings communicated were reconstructions. She was clear about this, attempts to put into English something that didn't arrive in English. Now, if the question is being asked in a form that bypasses language and arrives as a direct concept, then the question we're analysing is already a translation, already an approximation, already filtered through the witness's own cognitive framework and vocabulary. But here's what's important. Across all the translations, the core concept remains stable. Something about the interior experience of being human. Something about what it feels like, not what it looks like or measures like. Something they are trying to access from the outside and apparently cannot. A translation problem that produces consistent results is not, generally, a problem with the translation. It's a consistent signal coming through an imperfect medium, and the signal says, we do not understand what you feel, and we need to. The deeper I went into this, into the secondary literature, the private archives, the recorded hypnotherapy sessions I was given access to through a network of researchers who've been working this territory for decades, the more certain I became that the question is real. Not necessarily that the events are real in a simple, literal sense, but that the question, as reported, represents something genuine about the nature of whatever is happening to these witnesses. Something consistent, something structural, something with an agenda behind it. Let me try to put it together. Across 60 years of testimony, across cases in Brazil, Scotland, Minnesota, New York, rural England, suburban Texas, across witnesses who range from farmers to forestry workers to writers to housewives, across regression sessions and conscious recollections and spontaneous memories and structured interviews. One question returns, not about our technology, not about our governance, not about our military capacity or our resource extraction or our biological diversity, not, notably, about our potential threat, about what we feel. What does this tell us about whoever, even whatever, is doing the asking? It tells us they have information about us that we would consider highly advanced. They can apparently locate specific individuals, navigate the interior of human inhabited spaces, conduct complex biological procedures, communicate in a form that bypasses language, return people without, in most cases, lasting physical harm. This is not the behaviour of a civilization at or below our technological level, but it also tells us they have a gap, a specific targeted gap. The subjective interior of human emotional experience is, apparently, not something they can access through their other means. It is opaque to them. And they know it is opaque to them, and they are trying to close that opacity, one person at a time, in examination rooms that witnesses describe in almost identical terms across 6 decades. Why does this matter? Why do they need it? I don't know. I'm going to be honest. I don't know. And I think that honesty is important because the tendency in this field, and I've noticed it and I've resisted it, is to fill gaps in evidence with narrative, to make the story complete by extrapolating beyond what the data supports. What the data supports is the question. What it supports is the gap. What it supports is the urgency. What it does not tell us is why emotional experience is what they're missing, or what they intend to do with whatever approximation of it they're gathering, or whether they're gathering it for their own understanding or for something more operational. And the silence around those questions, across official records, across institutional response, across the 6 decades during which this has apparently been occurring, the silence is deafening. I want to come back at the end to the people, because there's a dimension of this that the pattern analysis risks obscuring. These are not data points, they are people who had an experience, whatever that experience was, that changed them. Many of them profoundly, many of them permanently, many of them in ways they found difficult to articulate to anyone who hadn't been through something similar. A woman named Karin, whose 1994 encounter near Gothenburg, Sweden, was documented by Swedish researcher Klas Svan, described the aftermath of her experience as a kind of permanent alteration. Not trauma, she said, though she acknowledged others might frame it that way. Something more like having had a concept installed in your mind that wasn't there before. A new category, a new awareness of the fact that her interior experience was hers alone. Hers was in a way she had never fully appreciated before something from outside looked at it and couldn't see in. She said it made her more aware of what she was, not in an abstract sense, in a felt sense, because something had tried to understand what she was and apparently hadn't fully succeeded. And that failure, the being's apparent failure to access what she felt, had paradoxically made her more aware of it. They wanted to know what I was feeling, she told Svan, and I realised I didn't entirely know either, and that felt important, like the question was the gift, not the answer. I've thought about that a lot, the question as the gift, because if you take this pattern at face value, if you allow for the possibility that something has been systematically asking humanity about its emotional interior for 60 years and still hasn't found what it's looking for, then what does that say about the thing being sought? What does it say about emotion and consciousness and the specific quality of being human, that it remains elusive even to a civilization that can apparently do everything else? What does it say that the hardest thing to know about us is not our weapons or our history or our biology, but what it is like to be inside a feeling? I started this investigation skeptically. I want to be clear about that. I came in looking for the seam where the stories fell apart, the inconsistencies that would reveal cultural contamination or mass delusion, or the specific gravity of a myth pulling on human imagination. I found inconsistencies. The cases are full of them. Contradictions, gaps, memories that shift under pressure, witnesses whose reliability is genuinely questionable. All of that is real, and I'm not asking you to ignore it. But I also found the question consistent across the inconsistencies, stable across the contradictions, present in the cases that are plausibly fabricated and the cases that are genuinely difficult to explain away. Like something in the signal that survives the noise. And the question is about emotion, about the interior life, about what it is like to be a feeling creature. And whatever is asking it appears to need the answer badly enough to have been asking it for 60 years. That says something about them, about what they don't have, or can't access, or are trying to build towards some purpose we can't yet see. The evidence suggests something much larger than we're accounting for when we talk about this phenomenon in terms of craft and lights and aerial anomalies. The craft is not the point. The lights are not the point. The question is the point, and we don't know what happens with the answers. We don't know if the answers have been enough. We don't know if the data collection is ongoing. We don't know if it ever stopped. We don't know if there are files somewhere, in private vaults, in research archives, in the records of the researchers who spent their lives on this and took much of what they knew with them, that contains something like a map of what we've told them, a partial map of human emotional experience, assembled one frightened, confused, strangely moved person at a time. What would they do with that map? What are they building exactly that requires knowing what we feel? The question they keep asking is a window into a gap in their knowledge. But the shape of that gap, the specific thing they can't see without asking, is itself a window into something about human consciousness that we barely understand ourselves. What is it like to feel? We've been living inside the answer our entire lives. We still can't fully articulate it. They've been asking about it